Welcome. This is the Steel Guitar Arts Council, and we got a very special guest today. We got a friend of mine. We go way back. Bruce Bouton. Everybody's heard him. Man, you played on hundreds and hundreds of really cool records. I'm pretty jealous. I had a moment the other day. I'll just start out with this. Was listening to, my wife was playing it, and it was called, I think, In the Vicinity of the Heart.
Somewhere in the vicinity.
Yeah,
of Shenandoah.
Shenandoah with Alison Krauss.
Yeah.
And there's a point, I think, after the first chorus where the steel comes in and then Alison comes in singing. But the steel comes in, it's the most beautiful thing. It's up nice and loud. It was majestically played. And I was going, holy shit, that's Bruce. I'm so jealous. And my wife Ginger's going, well, you should be. That's pretty good stuff. So anyhow, and maybe we'll play a little clip of that.
Oh, you're funny, because I went back and listened to it afterwards, and I went, I wish I'd played something else there.
Oh, no, it was a perfect thing. It was a great moment in steel guitar, but you've got a bunch of them.
Those were the days, those were the Don Cook days, which were, there's a producer friend of mine named Don Cook, but he was a songwriter, and he had written songs for like Lee Greenwood and T.G. Shepherd and everything, and he called me up one day and said, hey man, I think I'm going to produce a record on Kix Brooks. I'm going to try to be a producer. You want to play? And I said, sure, because I've been going over to his house and playing these horrible demos with him on this one of those Akai 12 tracks. I don't know if you remember those machines or not, and he would engineer, and it would just be, oh my gosh, But I did it, because back then you did everything, you tried to do everything. And I said, who are you going to have playing, man? Who else is going to be in the band? He said, well, there's this young guitar player named Brent Mason, and we're going to have Glenn Worf on bass, and John Jarvis, and Mark Cass Stevens, and Lonnie Wilson. And we're going to cut it at the Tree Demo Studio, which was, at the time, was a pretty funky little place. It was an old MCI board and a 25-track and 24-track, and he had Mike Bradley, the demo engineer. And we're sitting there getting ready to cut Kix things, and all of a sudden, Tim Dubois walks in, who, Tim, he just started Arista Records. And he and Scott Hendricks had created this band called Restless Heart, which was huge. It was, they jokingly used to say it was the country Toto,
Right.
And Scott walked in with Ronnie Dunn, and Brooks Dunn was born. And we spent the whole winter cutting that first Brooks Dunn record. And half of us didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I had played on a few records, and Glenn had played on one hit record with me, with Foster and Lloyd, but Brent Mason hadn't played on any hits yet. Lonnie Wilson hadn't played on any hits yet. Lonnie had just come out of a band as a lead singer.
Right, Bandana.
Bandana, yeah. I couldn't remember the name of it, but Lonnie was we all did these demos. We all played together. We did Tree demos. We did RCA demos, with Glenn Middleworth and stuff. And Cass Stevens, of course, had been around. Cass Stevens and Martin Don had come to town together back in the day and played Opryland, but Cass Stevens had played on a lot of records and did TV shows. Brilliant acoustic player. And Jarvis, of course, had played on Hot Legs when he was 19 by Rod Stewart and had done all the Bowen stuff. But we just sat there all winter and just cut all these songs. And Bradley mixed them, and he turned the bass and drums up. It was kind of the first time on a country record that, Bradley was like, hey, why don't these records sound like rock records and pop records, back then? And it hit. And so it became a run for probably 6 or 7 years with Don, where that band and Don cut a bunch of stuff. And we eventually did, some Shenandoah stuff, Jamie Baker's Love Slave and some of those memorable records. But we cut that record with Allison.
Okay, well, it was just a magic moment, and I'm still jealous.
Well, I'm flattered. Because I'm such a fan of yours, man, and I have listened. I've known you. You mentioned it, but I think we were talking a little while ago. We've known each other for over 40 years, which is crazy.
Yeah, we met. I think I knew you. I came when I was living in Minneapolis, and Ricky Skaggs came to town, and I think you called, and so me and my roommate came down and saw you guys with Ray Flack and everything hanging around. So you're part of the reason I ended up coming to Nashville was, just being inspired by, you were very happening. We playing on all those Ricky records. What year was the first Ricky record?
I go back and forth, but I kind of thought it was earlier. I think 1980.
Okay.
I believe, but it might have been 81 because I don't remember what year John Lennon died. Did he die in 80?
81, I think.
No, I think he died in 80.
Okay.
Because but I'd always thought it was 79 because but it was 80 because I was with Lacey J and I was sitting. We're getting ready to open for Delbert McClinton at the Roxy, and my life was falling apart. The Lacey tour was about to end, and it was our last gig in December, and I remember being in the Sunset Beverly Hotel and turning on the 6 o'clock news, which would have been 8 o'clock in New York. And it said John Lennon died, and I just sat on the bed and sobbed. And then we went down and played the gig, and it was Delbert McClinton and keyboard player. I walked up to him, I said, "Hey man, I'm Bruce." He said, "Hey, I'm Reese." And James Pennybaker and Billy, what's his name? The guy wore the hat, Billy. Anyway, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I came back to Nashville, and I had met Ricky. There's a guitar player named Ray Flack, who I probably owe him and Bucky Baxter. Basically, I look back, I owe, if things hadn't happened with either one of those guys, none of my career would have happened.
Right.
But I knew Ray. I'd lived with him for a while, and we were he was running out, he was playing with Joe's son and everything, but Ray got on a Rodney Crowell session, and Ricky was playing acoustic guitar, and Ricky said, "Hey Ray, I like your playing." He was still with Emmy, but he said, I got a record deal. I'd like you to play in my band. Do you know any steel players? And Ray said, "Well, I know this guy, Bruce Bouton." So Ray called me up, and he said, "Man, get in Ricky's face every time you see him." So we just happened to end up playing a festival a week or so later with Lacey J, but Emmy Lou was on it. And I walked up to Ricky and introduced myself. And then, I don't know, I think probably in January, Ray called me up and said, "Hey, look, I'm playing this club over on Nolensville Road." And I can't remember the club, I'm sure we all played there. But he said, "Bring your steel down, Ricky's gonna be there." And I bought my steel down, and Ricky came up to me afterwards and said, "You mind if I come over to your house tomorrow?" And I had this little house on Dakota Avenue, and Ricky came over, and we sat in the room, and we went through the whole first album. And he just, "Crying My Heart Out Over You," and "I Don't Care," and "If That's the Way You Feel," and it was just me and him in an acoustic. And it's funny, he said, "Well, Bruce, would you like to be in my band?" And it kind of freaked me out because it was so country, So I said, "Can I think about it?" Because I was thinking Lacey might happen again, but I don't know, I think that band probably wasn't going to get called back because it was a rough tour. Lots of drugs and alcohol and just driving around in Winnebago, and it was a crazy tour, but also Fischel had left Commander Cody and joined Emmy Lou's band, and I thought maybe that would be a cool gig. So I called Fischel up, and Fischel had already gotten in the hot band. He goes, "Dude, you better pick up the phone the minute you wake up in the morning and call him and tell him you want that gig, because it won't be the hot band, but it will be a hot band."
Yeah.
And so I got up the next morning, I called Ricky and said, "Hey man, I thought about this. I'd love to be in your band." He said, "Well, Bruce, that's great." I said, "Can I play on your record?" And I never played on a record in my life. I barely played on any demos.
Right.
And 2 weeks later, I walk into a session, and there's Joe Osborne on bass, and Jerry Croon, and Buck White on piano, Ray Flack, and first time I met Bobby Hicks. And we cut Crying My Heart Out Over You, and we cut I Don't Care, and we cut You May See Me Walking, and it was country, man. It was hillbilly, but then all of a sudden Rolling Stone did a review and said, this is the best country record. And then I had friends of mine saying, man, you know, I love your steel tone, because they turned it, you know, Ricky.
Turned the steel up. It was proud in the mix.
Everything. Well, it was only 5 pieces, 6 pieces on there, and it was basically like a picture, you know. And it was bluegrass. It was basically that same concept of, hey, okay, mandolin, step closer to the mic. Guitar, step closer to the mic. Fiddle, you know. And that's how those records were, and they were all bluegrass tunes.
Right.
But it hit. I mean, the labels were scared to death. The labels were terrified. They didn't know what to do with it, the CBS, but it hit, and it was the first, it went gold, which back then, in the early 80s, for record, the only people that went gold were like Kenny Rogers and Waylon and Willie.
Right.
You know, nothing went gold. Barbara Mandrell, all those people that were having all those huge hits, that was a publishing airplay game, you know, and none of those people ever sold more than 100,000 records.
Tell me this, when you were working on Ricky's record with that band, what was the pacing? Like how many sessions would you have done? How many songs would you do in a session? How long would it take to do I Don't Care? I mean, did you work on that all day? Did you knock it out in an hour? Do you remember the pace?
I remember we went in and we'd do the song, we'd learn the song, and we'd cut it. We probably got the track pretty quick, because it was Osborne and Croon.
Right.
But I remember going over to Lee Hazen's studio by the pond and doing overdubs. And I think some of the stuff was what I played on the track, but what I may have, you know, I remember the only song I really had a lot of trouble with was Waiting for the Sun to Shine. And I'll explain what happened there, since we're talking to steel players. But backing up, Ricky would listen to the parts, and, you know, and I think a lot of the stuff was good, because it's all simple stuff, and I just played what I knew, you know, and it was totally, you know, innocent back then. But he wanted me to double everything, and he called it cloning.
Right.
And what's really amazing is all of the parts on that first album are doubled, but you can't really tell they're doubled. They didn't sound like, you know, what Sonny would do. Sonny would sometimes double, and one thing would have a chorus, and it was actually an effect. But as I said, I just only knew what I knew. Right. And so I went to it. But I remember we did Waiting for the Sun to Shine, and that was really hard, because it was there was melodic parts, and the only place I could get them was you know, where they sounded right, where you can get them all to run together, was the E to F pedal on the steel, you know.
Which we were just talking about.
And I didn't know at the time. I couldn't figure out why, if I was right over the fret, it was out of tune. You know, and I wasn't smart enough to realize that everything, you know, because like when you're playing a steel, you know, it's like you know, your you know, that note, the fifth string is a 5 of the chord right there, and then when you hit the pedals, it becomes a 3 of the chord, and then when you go up here, it becomes a 1 of the new chord. But you can't really look down at it, but I'm pretty north of the fret here. But back then I didn't know it, so I'd be going, and it'd be flat, and I'd be going, what's going on? I'd be freaking out, and we'd have to go over it. You know, I didn't know anything back then. I was just, I hadn't realized it too.
Well, I think a lot of people just think that steel guitar is a chord machine. You put the bar there and it's going to be in tune, and you really need to finesse the bar to play, especially when you start raising that fifth or the fourth string a half tone. It's a touchy place.
Well, everything's a touchy place. And, you know, I after we cut that first record, you know, I was living with Ray Kennedy. I don't know if you guys know Ray Kennedy, but Ray's turned into, you know, just this mad scientist, incredible engineer, you know, producer. But back then, we were all living together. He was trying to be a country artist, trying to be a country singer. And, you know, he had learned how to sync two cassette tapes together and get sound on sound. This was before he became this remarkable engineer that he is. And we all lived in the house for wayward men, we called it. And I was out having cocktails somewhere, chasing some girl or something. And I called home to check in with Ray, see what was going on. He said, man, Buddy Emmett's just called over here. And I went, bullshit. And he said, because Buddy was like, oh my God,
yeah.
Buddy was God. He said, Buddy called here. He wanted to talk to you. And I said, no, he didn't. He said, yeah, I did. I looked it up in the Union book. And it was him. So I called Buddy, and Buddy goes, yeah, you know, yeah, Bruce, how are you, man? He said, I said, hi, Buddy, you know, not, and he goes, who's that guitar player that's working with you all? Ray Charles wants to talk to him about playing on something. And I'm like, oh, he just wanted Ray's name. But I said, you know, and I said, man, I see that you're doing that seminar at Jeff Newman's. And I just said, man, I'd love to go, but I really can't, you know, I don't have the time, or maybe I'm touring, or I can't afford it. I forgot what I said. And he said, oh man, you don't have to go to a seminar. Why don't you come over to the house? And I freaked out, and I went over to his house, and it was amazing. But at the time, he was experimenting with tuning everything to 440.
Mm-hmm.
And in retrospect, you look back and you hear some of those records that he played with that tuning. On the E9, it doesn't sound quite right.
Right.
Even though the playing is remarkable.
Right.
I mean, Buddy would play this. So he said, you ought to try it. So I did that, you know, because he said, because then if you got everything to 440, then allegedly things on your frets will be right, but all your thirds will be ringing very sharp and not real pleasant. And I went back for the work on the second album with Ricky, and we cut Highway 40 Blues. And we had been rehearsing it a little bit on sound check, you know, because he had cut it bluegrass. And the intro lick of that was really Jerry Douglas played that on dobro, so I didn't come up with that intro lick, but Ray and I harmonized it. And then we got into the body of the song, and the single note stuff sounded cool with me and Ray harmonizing, but then after the first take, Ricky goes, Bruce, you're out of tune. And I freaked, and I had to rush, and I had to put this guitar right here, and I had to, you know, quickly start tuning back. And anybody who plays one of these guitars, it's a job. Not an easy task to all of a sudden. But I got back into it and got it fixed. And then I started, we called it gurming back then, you know, where you're bugging people. But, you know, I would go, every steel player that came into the Opry and everything, and everybody, I'd go up to them and say, hey man, can I sit down at your steel? You know, sat down at Hal Rugg's steel, sat down at Lloyd's steel, and I'd listen to the, you know, I'd listen to how, where they had their thirds, and, you know, how this did, and where that note was, you know, and I just listen, and I'd try to figure it out. And it turned out most of the professional steel players tune like I did. Mm-hmm. They tuned more to a sweeter sound. And I remember the 7th string was always an issue, because if you've got the 7th string, if you have it tuned where it's you want to have it with that chord, that's great, but if you hit your pedal, you know, it really needs down here. And on my all-pull guitars, I will lower that string a little bit with my first pedal to sweeten up the chord thing. But, you know, everybody would do it different, so I got used to, if I came up to play that voicing, I'd slant my bar back a little bit. But anyway, I remember the 7th string or something was bugging me, and I went to Weldon one day, and Weldon, I'd been seeing Weldon a lot because we'd been doing the Opry. Mm-hmm. Weldon was this amazing, gentle giant of a steel player who was very soft-spoken until he wasn't, when he got irritated a little bit. And I went up with some other stupid question about tuning. He finally looked at me and said, hey man, tune your steel and learn how to play it in tune. And that opened, all of a sudden I went, oh, okay, so if I need to play sharp here, I need to play sharp here.
That's why you have a bar, yeah.
I have a bar, and if I need to just play 2 notes here, I play 2 notes, and you know, And then after that, things really started falling into a better place.
Ginger and I came and saw you when you were at the Hall of Fame a month or two ago, and I had learned a lot by what you had to say that day, and there is a lot of interesting connections in your career where you would just happen to run into somebody and meet them, and then some time would pass. The next thing you know, you were playing on hit records with them and things like that. Just tell me about a couple of those situations.
Well, it really starts with Bucky Baxter, who was my bad brother, and who's dead now, unfortunately, but was just a brilliant musician. He was also a larger-than-life character,
Right.
Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But Bucky was our roadie when I lived in Nashville. I mean, lived in Richmond, Virginia in the 70s, and when I would get up and sing songs, Bucky would come up and play steel. And he would tour the road with us, and we did too many drugs together and too much drinking and all this kind of stuff. But I finally quit that band, and Bucky took my place. And so I was trying to get to Nashville, but I hadn't gotten to Nashville, and I was up in D.C., and Bucky asked me to come down to Nashville and take lessons from Paul Franklin. I didn't have any money, and he said, well, my dad will lend you the money. So we drove to Nashville, because Paul and Jernigan were teaching for $10 an hour at Mars Music. And we moved down here, and I called the only guy I knew in Nashville, which was a writer named Sam Lorber. And he didn't have a place. He said, I can't let you stay at my house because this English guitar player is flying in, but we're having a barbecue, come over. And I went over and I met Ray Flack. I went back home. When I moved back to Nashville, I ended up moving into a house with Ray. So Ray got me the job with Ricky. Well, later on, I was terrible. I'm embarrassed at the way I acted back then. I mean, how aggressive I was at chasing things, but nothing I can do about the past, but. But then there were just innocent moments. One night I was doing laundry at this all-night laundromat over on Blair Boulevard in Nashville, and it was just me and this kind of lanky, young hippie chick sitting on the washer. And we started talking. I said, so what do you do? She said, well, I'm a singer, but I work at Fridays. And she said, what do you do? And I said, well, I play steel guitar. And she was like, who do you play with? And I said, well, I work with Ricky Skaggs. And she said, wow, you play on all those records. I said, yeah. And she said, man, I love your playing. If I ever get a record deal, I'm going to call you. Well, years later, after Ricky had fired me and I was working with Mel Tillis, I was out on the road, and I get a call from a producer named Alan Reynolds, who had produced Crystal Gale and Don Williams and written all these incredible songs and everything. And Alan said, hey, Bruce, Kathy Mattea suggested I give you a call. She just cut a record. Would you like to come in and play? And I was on the road, and they wanted to do it. I wasn't going to make it home on the bus, so I went and bought my plane ticket and flew home to do the session. And I walked in, and I cut this record called 18 Wheels and a Dozen Roses. And it became a #1 record. And basically maybe a year later, I don't know when it was, I don't remember, the time kind of runs together, but I get a call again, it's Alan again. He said, hey man, I'm cutting these sides on this guy named Garth Brooks. Do you want to come in and play? And I walked in, and we cut Much Too Young. I overdubbed. Much Too Young to Be This Dang Old and Not Counting You. And I never remember the third song, but at the time, Buddy Spiker was playing fiddle on it. And Much Too Young was, I think it was first take on that solo. It was just, it was licks, but I was in my game at the time to be able to play, the fast eighth note stuff, the way I played it. But Bob Doyle, who had been my guy at ASCAP, because I'd written a hit song for T. Graham Brown around the same time, had previously told me that he was leaving to manage this guy named Garth Brooks. So I think Bob might have thrown my name in the hat also. But I heard the mixes afterwards, and I was happy with what I played on Much Too Young, but I hated what I played on the other two. And part of it was because of the fiddle parts. I could never find a way to get in the middle of Buddy at the time. And I called Alan up, and it was at the time Ray Flack said, "Don't do that, man. That shows a weakness." But I said, "No, I'm going to call him." And I called Alan, and I said, "Man, I'd love to come back and take another shot at those songs. You don't have to pay me." He said, "Man, I can't believe you called. I'm getting this young guy, this new guy in named Rob Hajakis to replace the fiddle." And so Rob and I overdubbed at the same time. And of course, I knew Rob from Virginia.
Right, right.
And he was the first guy I ever knew to move to Nashville. But anyway, that created the relationship with Garth. And then, you know, it just went from there, you know. I mean, Don happened because I dragged my shit back to his horrible home studio in his backyard.
Right. Well, you put in your hours, you put in your time. And also, I've got to say that there's a lot of steel guitar players, a lot of great steel guitar players on the planet. I listened to quite a few of them. You have your own patented tone. You have a tone. And nothing will get you further in the world of steel guitar than having a tone that you can identify. I hear you on the radio and I know it's you. It's a very defined tone. There's a real nice, sweet high end. Your pitch is great, but it's the tone. It's just, you have that, you still have it. You've been playing here this morning. You sit down, you play the guitar, I know it's you. And I think that's more important than anything. Is I don't feel that you sat and tried to learn. You might have learned how to play some licks from here or there, but you developed your own sound. And
thank you. I mean, that's what I try to tell myself when I beat myself up for all the time I wasted not learning, you know, the stuff I should have learned.
Yeah, but maybe not learning that got you, you know, I think a lot of times it's if you sit and learn everybody else's licks, you sound like everybody else. But in my case, I'm just lazy. I'll start to learn something and then I get sidetracked. And the next thing I do, I have worked up something that is unique. So it's...
Well, you probably know this, but there's a whole bunch of steel players that came out of D.C. that studied with Buddy Charlton.
Right.
And Buddy was amazing. Buddy, you know, sat there and he'd give me shit. I'd come in and say, "Man, you know, like a lot of steel players will sit there and they're playing their thumb like this, you know, where it's not, you know, they may be pushing forward on the side of their pick, but you know." Buddy said, "You've got to get your thumb right." And he would sit there and hold my arm in while we were playing and say, "Get that thumb around," where I basically would come under the string almost, you know. It's hard to explain, but stuff like that, you know, and I would sit there for hours a lot of times and just practice, just, you know, getting grips and just going over different grips and just sitting there working on a note. But what she said about learning stuff, Buddy would give me a lot of grief about it because he'd teach all those instrumentals. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't learn them. I'd sort of learn part of them.
Right.
But I'd learn one part and I'd figure out how to use it in a song.
Right.
And that's what he said to me. He said, "Man, you know, you're different than all my other students, but he said, you figure out how to use this stuff."
Very good.
And so that I never ever spent a long enough time. I think, honestly, I probably spent more time on Paul Franklin's early single note stuff than anything because I was working with Skaggs and trying to figure out how to, you know, play through changes.
Right.
And then, of course, Weldon Myrick and Hal Rugg took one of Paul's licks and made a little 45 record, the amazing,
I remember,
you know. That was it right there. So basically, when I had to do the solo for Highway 40, you know, I came in after the fiddle and so I just. So in the chord changes on it was, you know, da, da, da. So I'm just sort of playing around those notes, and then it goes to the 2 chord, you know, and Buddy had done that thing. He was putting this thing on records.
Right, the banjo roll.
Yeah, and I was going. So it was just a bunch of different licks all coming together back then, and it was just, to me, it was just, I would kind of try to learn stuff that I could just use, mechanical things, and you know, in retrospect now, I wish I'd taken it farther, but back then it worked. And when I was doing all that Skaggs stuff, I'd heard Paul Franklin, you know, playing with Mel Tillis, and he was doing all that. With just the E to F pedal, and I do all that stuff. So that's what I like, One Way Rider and Country Boy and all that, and then Buddy stuff, you know. You know, he was Buddy. You know, I mean, it was just, to me, it was just, if I could hear something that I could steal, no pun intended, and use it somewhere.
Yeah, but you made it your own, and like I said before, with all of what you just did, you have a tone. You came out with a fully adult tone, which a lot of guys are still grasping after. And a tone is, to me, it's like having a voice. It's like a great singer has a voice, their voice, it's their sound. And a lot of steel players just never quite get there, but you had that from the get-go, from when you were, you know, started making records. And I think that's made a big difference.
Well, you too. I mean, you understand that thing too. I mean, you have an original sound, but I think one thing that we have in common, and that, you know, I always tell somebody, there's this big circle here in Nashville, and you got Paul Franklin, you got Dan Dugmore, you got Russ Pahl, you got Steve Hinson, you got Scotty Sanders, you got Mike Johnson, and who am I leaving out that's been doing sessions? Sonny Garish, when he was still doing a lot of sessions. Yeah. You know, you have all these guys, you know, and back when we first came down, there was Hal, and there was Weldon, and there was Buddy, and Lloyd, and Larry Sasser, and Pete Drake. I mean, every one of them had a different voice. Right. And, you know, and every one of them had a gift, a unique gift. And, you know, and I think the one that I probably am most envious of is Dan Dugmore. Yeah. His brain. Yeah. The way his brain works. The way he plays behind a singer. Yep. You know. And knows how to just, you know, I was talking to somebody one time, and we were just talking about steel players, just having one of these. He was a keyboard player, friend of mine, but we were just talking about steel players. And, you know, we were talking about you and Scotty and Henson, because everybody works with everybody else, and everybody, you know. And I said, so what's the deal with Dan Dugmore? And he said, man, he just makes the record sound more expensive. Yeah.
Well, he had a lot of, I think Dan has a lot of what I've always thought that Pete Drake had. He served the song, and he was not playing licks. He was just playing the music, and you could tell he was listening to the lyrics and thoroughly into the emotion of the song. Yeah. You know, plus he's got a patented tone.
Well, he had a DNA that he just got to inherit back. I mean, he was, what's really funny, and I should, you know, I was starting to happen in the early 90s. And then something else happened, which was really advantageous to me. Paul Franklin took the gig with Dire Straits. And I remember I'm thinking, oh boy, this is going to be great. And of course, you know, trying to raise 2 kids and, I mean, support a family and everything, you know, that was all, you know, you had all that, and trying to keep a career and all this stuff. And I'm sitting there going, man, this is going to be great. I'm going to be working. I mean, there was one time when I was on 7 records in the top 10, which was just bizarre. I mean, you know, it just happenstance. Mm. Then Josh Leo brought Dan Dugmore in, and he was going to use him on half of an album that I thought I was going to play on the whole album. Mm-hmm. And I got it kind of bummed me out at first. And thankfully, I said, wait a minute, how in the world are you getting bummed out? You listened to this guy in the 70s, and you'd hear him on the radio, and you heard Blue Bayou, and you heard Tracks of My Tears, and you heard the James Taylor stuff, and you loved everything he played, and you're sitting there now mad because he suddenly moved to Nashville, and everybody's, you know, and I realized that everybody had those records. All the girls wanted to be Linda Ronstadt, and all the guys wanted to be James Taylor, and all of a sudden,
here was their guy.
Here was the guy.
Yeah.
And he played great stuff, and he came up with licks that just, you heard the lick, and you knew the song.
Yep.
You know, it's like, you know, Boys of Summer, when Mike Campbell, that's all you hear, and you know it's the song. Or I Won't Back Down, you know, I mean, just records forever and ever.
You gave him a signature.
But he was also, Dan was a great guitar player. He grew up in the middle of that, in that era when they were inventing all that country rock stuff. And so Dan, you know, Dan's become a great friend and probably one of the most beloved.
Yeah, well, he's a great hang. I mean, he's got great stories, and he has a great temperament having a session. So,
that's something that, you know, if I could give advice in retrospect, I didn't always have a great temperament, you know, and I would let things bug me. You know, if I thought something was wrong, instead of just going, you know what, you can be out of here in 2 hours. Just go on. I'd sit there, I'd fight it. Or I'd, you know, if I didn't like the headphones. But I look back on it personally, and I'm preaching a little bit, but I look back on it personally, and I think that was probably because of my alcohol abuse.
Okay.
You know, I mean, which is, you know, I mean, I think I was a functioning alcoholic for 50 years, you know, I mean, when I look back, because you know, so you'd come in and you'd be slightly hungover from the night before, and you got up at 5 o'clock to take your kids to school and everything like that, and you walk in with a headache, and the headphones don't sound right, and instead of sitting there and going, okay, what do I need to do here? You know, hey, hey man, you know, or whatever.
Right.
Or, you know, Paul Franklin gave me some great advice. I mean, there were 3 great pieces of advice. Lloyd, and I've told this story over and over again, but Lloyd Green, when I first played on my first record, Lloyd Green came up and complimented me. And Lloyd's very analytical. Bruce, I really enjoyed what you played. It was very intelligent. It was an intelligent part, and your tone was good, and your intonation was good. And I went, what do I need to do to be a session player? And I thought he was going to tell me to play a JBL speaker or something, or change your strings every week. And he stopped for a minute. He said, listen to the words. And then, of course, the other great piece of advice, which Weldon gave me, learn to tune your guitar and learn how to play it in tune. But probably one of the most profound pieces of advice I got was from Paul Franklin. He said, man, you've got to learn where to stand in the room. And I've had this discussion many times since then, because I was, you know, you remember I had my Sideman show, for instance, which interviewed people, but I also, you know, ended up doing a lot of representing musicians for intellectual property stuff, and I got to be really good friends with a lot of my heroes in LA, you know, studio players. And we'd have these discussions about the psychological part of doing sessions. You know, you walk in, who's the leader? Who's the leader on this session? What kind of person? Is he an alpha dog? Is he going to be upset if you argue with him? If you debate him? You know, who's this producer? Is this producer? The producers are funny, as you know. I mean, a lot of producers have no confidence at all. And if you walk up to him and say, hey man, I think I can do that thing better, they kind of go, ooh, who have I hired here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but other producers, if you come in and say, man, I think I can do that part, they go, yeah, that'd be great. Maybe you could do this. Maybe you could do that. So that's learning where to stand in the room, being able to do that psychological study, and do that psychological study of that artist,
Right.
and be able to hear where somebody says something, you know, and not be offended by it.
Right, right.
And I was terrible about being offended by things. You know, why didn't I get hired? And then, you know, I look back and I go, well, probably because I was an asshole on the session before. And in spite of everything, I still had a decent career. But
oh, you had a hell of a career, Bruce.
But, you know, my advice to, and Leland Sklar, you know, I couldn't believe it, because you look at Leland Sklar and you think he's the wildest man on earth, and he's never had a drink and he's never done a drug.
Right, right.
You know, and he said it in one interview. He said, man, don't, you know, and I mean, other people can handle these things better than others, but we all know people that have tragically blown up in the music world because of abuse, and thankfully I didn't.
Yeah.
But, you know, but yeah, it's a dance. The studio dance is and you're really good at it.
You've just have had a great career. You continue to have a great career. I remember telling you 3 or 4 years ago that you know, you were the steel guitar sound of the '90s. You know, if I had to say who was the guy, it was you. And you know, that's all coming back now, and you know, you're back around the cycle. You know, that's pretty cool.
I'm working enough, and I don't care.
Yeah,
I do care, but I mean, I'm just enjoying the joy of being able to go into a room now. And I can't say I love modern country music very much, but that's sort of going away. It's starting to get back to melody and stuff. I mean, you know. But then again, the other side of the coin is I'm kind of fascinated with the ability to get tones now. Yeah. I mean, you know, delays and reverbs, and just be able to, you know, because I remember at one point, you know, an engineer didn't even want you to put spring reverb on your.
No. We've gone through every cycle. I mean, there was a time when we couldn't even bring amplifiers.
Did you ever build a rack?
Oh, yes. I used it on one session and threw it away. It didn't work. So
I spent our buddy Dave Wilkerson. You know, he had that. I forget what the place was called, but I remember I built a big rack, and I would spend all my time trying to make it sound like a good amp. Yeah. And I spent thousands of dollars on it. Yeah. And it just I could never get it together.
Well, we all had to go through that. That was the fashion at the time. So, well, listen, I think we're going to wrap up here, and I just want to say it's this kind of happened at the last minute. We were talking about doing an interview, and then sort of an opening came up. So you were gracious enough to show up this morning, and I figured, well, Bruce and I know each other pretty darn well. I don't need to do a lot of prep for this, you know, because the last 40 years have been prep for this interview. So,
we got lucky, man.
You know, you are one of the great voices on the instrument.
Oh, thank you. So are you.
Played on so many great records, iconic things, and you know, it's just great to have you here today, Bruce.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored. I know I babbled along, but I'm kind of, you know, you kind of get to be this age and you start going, well, maybe if somebody, you know, hears something, you know, they can save some steps, you know, they can, you know, make like, you know, we all have our young friends like Whit and Eddie Dunlop and everybody that are all, you know, they're coming up.
They're coming up and they're taking over.
Yeah.
We can still show them a thing or two. So.
Oh, yeah, we can.
Well, anyhow.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks,
you. Bruce.
All right, cool.
Take care.
Appreciate it, Russ.